My name is Emily, and from a young age I knew I was never the priority in my parents' eyes. My older brother Brandon, who is 2 years older than me, was always the center of attention and the focus of their hopes and dreams. From my earliest memories, I could see the stark difference in how they treated us. Brandon received every opportunity, while I was often left on the sidelines, figuring out how to adapt on my own. When Brandon joined the school basketball team, my parents spared no expense to support him. They spent money on the best shoes, hired a private coach, and even hosted parties to celebrate his victories. I remember once telling my mom that I wanted to take an art class at the community center. She simply smiled and said, "Maybe next year, sweetie. This month's money has to go toward Brandon's training fees." I quickly learned it was better not to ask for anything, because the answer was always, "We don't have enough money." The disparity became even more glaring when Brandon entered his senior year of high school, and I was just 14. One evening at dinner, my parents proudly announced that they had saved enough money to send Brandon to a prestigious university out of state. Not only that, but they had also arranged for him to have a small apartment near campus so he could focus on his studies. I sat silently as my parents and brother enthusiastically discussed his bright future, my chest tightening with every word. I knew that if they had poured all their savings into Brandon, there would be nothing left for my college education. In the evenings that followed, I lay awake, worrying about my future. But instead of feeling defeated, I decided to take action and change my circumstances. The next day I visited my grandparents, who owned a small antique shop in town. I told them about my dream of going to college and the challenges I was facing. My grandfather looked at me thoughtfully and said, "Emily, I could give you the money, but I think it would be better if you earned it yourself. Would you like to work at the shop after school?" Without hesitation I nodded, feeling as if I had found a glimmer of hope in the darkness. From that day forward I began working at my grandparents' antique shop after school. The job wasn't easy, but I learned a great deal. I helped keep inventory, managed the shop, and sometimes listened to my grandmother share the history behind the old treasured items they sold. With every day of work, I felt closer to achieving my goal. When I told my parents about the job and my plan to save money for college, their reaction left me both saddened and more aware of my place in the family. They seemed relieved, as if my decision to take care of myself had lifted a burden off their shoulders. My teenage years passed in a blur of stark contrasts between how my parents treated me and Brandon. While they poured all their resources, affection, and attention into him, I had to learn how to stand on my own. Yet, that unfairness taught me the value of patience and perseverance. Although I often felt neglected, I knew I didn't want to spend my life living in Brandon's shadow, or being at the mercy of my parents' favoritism. I was determined to carve out my own path no matter how difficult it would be. The early days working at my grandparents' antique shop marked a significant turning point in my life. I was only 14, still naive and inexperienced, but the warmth and patience of my grandparents made me feel truly welcomed. My grandfather, a calm man with silver hair, meticulously taught me everything from inventory management to recognizing the value of antique items. My grandmother always greeted me with freshly baked cookies and captivating stories about the history behind the items we sold. For the first time, I found a place where I was valued, heard, and appreciated, something I had never felt at home. Working at the shop wasn't easy, especially while juggling school. Mornings were dedicated to focusing on my studies, and as soon as the school bell rang, I would head straight to the shop. At first, my body ached from standing all day, organizing shelves and assisting customers. But gradually I adapted to the rhythm of the work, and my effort began to pay off. At the end of each week, my grandparents would hand me a small paycheck. Each bill and coin went into a wooden box I kept at my bedside, and with every addition I felt a satisfaction I had never experienced before. It wasn't a large amount, but every dollar represented my hard work and determination, and I knew I was inching closer to my goal. While I kept myself busy with work and studies, things at home remained the same. My parents continued to pour all their attention into Brandon. Every evening, I would come home to find them deeply engrossed in discussions about his future, planning his move to the prestigious university, picking out furniture for his apartment, and ensuring everything was perfect for him. I didn't expect them to ask about my day, or offer encouragement. I had long accepted my place in the family. Yet, there were moments when the sight of them all huddled together while I sat quietly in the background made me ache with loneliness. I wanted to scream, "I'm your child too, I have dreams too, I need support too." But instead, I swallowed my pain, reminding myself that I didn't need them, that I could achieve my dreams on my own. 3 years passed and my job at the antique shop became more than just a means to save money for college. It taught me invaluable life lessons. I learned how to communicate with customers, evaluate the worth of items, and most importantly, face challenges with patience and resilience. These skills not only helped me at work, but also built my self-confidence, something I had lacked growing up in Brandon's shadow. By the time I reached my senior year of high school, I had saved enough to cover my first year at a nearby community college. I didn't tell my parents about the money I had saved because I knew they would see it as my responsibility, rather than a personal achievement. Instead, I shared the news with my grandparents, and the pride in their eyes was the only validation I needed. My grandfather even handed me an antique pocket watch saying, "You'll need this to remind yourself that time is the most precious resource. Don't waste it on people who don't value you." The night I received my acceptance letter, I sat in my small bedroom, feeling a quiet but profound happiness. I didn't need a grand celebration or lavish praise. What mattered was the recognition I gave myself. I knew that, no matter how challenging the road ahead might be, I was prepared to face it. I had not only grown from the unfairness I endured, but had turned it into a driving force for my success. And in that sense I was right. And I was proud of myself, and that was something no one could ever take away from me. Starting my college life, I, Emily, quickly realized that independence wasn't just about managing money. It was about learning to stand tall amidst challenges without family support. At 17, fresh out of high school, I enrolled in a community college near home. It wasn't the prestigious university my parents had boasted about when it came to Brandon, but to me, it was a dream I had built on my own. With the money I had saved over 3 years working at my grandparents' antique shop, I could cover my first year's tuition. To save costs, I continued living at home, but that meant enduring my parents' favoritism once again. While I balanced school and a part-time job at a cafe near campus, Brandon graduated college at 20 and became the family's shining star once more. My parents threw him a grand celebration, inviting friends, family, and neighbors. Meanwhile, when I completed my first year of college with stellar grades, no one in my family acknowledged it. That evening's dinner was just another ordinary meal I cooked for myself. No cake, no congratulations, no proud smiles. I quietly celebrated my success alone because I knew waiting for recognition from my parents would only lead to disappointment. Things worsened when Brandon announced his engagement to his girlfriend Grace the summer after his graduation. Not only that, but they planned to move into a spacious apartment in New York City. An apartment my parents readily supported financially to help them start their new life. While I scraped together every penny to cover tuition and the exorbitant cost of textbooks, my parents spared no expense for Brandon and Grace's lavish wedding. I wasn't jealous, but I felt a deep sadness realizing that, in my parents' eyes, I had never truly been a priority. That fall, as I started my second year of college, I decided it was time to move out. At home, I constantly felt like an outsider, someone misplaced within her own family. I found a small apartment near campus, modest but cozy enough to give me the sense of freedom I craved. My income from the cafe job covered my expenses, and I finally began to feel a sense of stability in my life. Free from the complaints and comparisons at home, I could fully focus on my studies and work. Even after distancing myself, my parents still found ways to interfere. One day my mom called me with an unexpected request. "Emily, you should send some money home. Brandon and Grace need extra help furnishing their new apartment," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. I was stunned. They had given Brandon all the support I had needed, and now they wanted me, a part-time working college student, to chip in so my brother could live comfortably? I took a deep breath and replied, "Mom, I'm sorry but I can't. I need the money for my education and living expenses." There was a pause before her tone turned colder. "Emily, we're family. You can't be so selfish." I didn't know how to respond. My entire life I had never been selfish. I had given up what I wanted, worked tirelessly to carry my own weight, and never asked for more than the bare minimum. Yet even now my efforts were dismissed. I hung up the phone, tears streaming down my face. Not out of guilt, but out of the realization that I would never receive the love or recognition I yearned for from my parents. In that moment, I made a decision. I wouldn't let myself be pulled into this cycle any longer. Instead of seeking validation from my family, I would start validating myself. And from that moment on, I knew my life was mine to shape, not theirs to dictate with their unreasonable expectations and favoritism. I never imagined I would face what happened when I was 20 years old. In my final year of college, balancing work and studies to prepare for my future, a call from my mom turned everything upside down. "Emily, Brandon is going through a tough time. You know, his business just failed, and Grace is really overwhelmed with taking care of the baby. They need a place to stay temporarily. Can you let them stay at your apartment? And if possible, could you help out a little financially?" I still had to live with my mom. "And if possible, could you help out a little financially?" My mom's voice carried an air of urgency, softened by an attempt to make it seem like this was the obvious, natural thing for me to do. I bit my lip, anger and frustration welling up inside me. I had worked hard to pay for this apartment, to build a peaceful life for myself, and now it was about to become chaotic. I wanted to say no, but my mom's pleading and veiled guilt, tripping me with little choice. "Fine, but only for a short while," I replied reluctantly. My mom sighed in relief, while I felt the weight of an enormous burden settle on my shoulders. He hadn't missed a beat. A few days later, Brandon, Grace, and their baby Tommy moved in. From the moment they stepped through the door, I knew my life was about to change drastically. Brandon carried himself with his usual air of arrogance, despite his evident failure. Grace looked perpetually exhausted, and Tommy's cries filled the small apartment, making it nearly impossible for me to concentrate on anything. Within weeks, my once peaceful home had turned into a chaotic mess. As I said, baby toys littered every corner, dirty dishes piled up in the sink, and tension hung thick in the air as Brandon and Grace bickered constantly. I tried to endure it, but things got worse when my parents demanded that I contribute more financially to support Brandon. "Emily, you've had a steady job, and you've been paying rent for this apartment all along, but now that there are more people, costs have gone up. We need you to chip in more," my mom said, her tone more of a command than a request. I tried to stay calm, but inside I was fuming. "But I'm sleeping on the couch, and I'm the one paying for everything here. Brandon and Grace could contribute a little, right?" I argued, trying to keep my voice steady. My mom simply responded, "Brandon has been through a rough time. You can't expect him to contribute right now." The unfairness of it all left me feeling even more disheartened. I was footing all the bills, living on a couch in my own apartment, while Brandon and Grace enjoyed the bedroom without contributing a dime. Every evening after work, I came home to a messy apartment, Tommy's relentless cries, and Brandon's complaints about how he didn't deserve to be treated like this. I felt invisible, reduced to nothing more than a means to accommodate everyone else's needs. Precisely how it should have been. In an attempt to improve the situation, I once suggested, "Brandon, my company is hiring for a few positions. I could refer you to HR, it could help you get back on your feet." But he just scoffed and replied, "A low-level job? Emily, I'm a businessman, I don't do menial work." His arrogance and lack of accountability were the final straw. I realized that no matter how much I sacrificed, Brandon, my parents, and Grace would never appreciate my efforts. End of page. Eventually, I knew I couldn't keep living like this. One evening, after staring at a pile of dirty dishes and listening to Tommy's cries that seemed endless, I opened my laptop and started searching for apartments. I found a small studio near my workplace, affordable with my salary. That night, I made the decision to move out and leave behind the people who had taken my help for granted. The next morning I called my mom and told her about my decision. She tried to persuade me to stay, but this time I didn't waver. I had endured enough, and it was time to prioritize myself. Moving out felt like lifting a massive weight off my shoulders. Even though I knew my parents wouldn't understand, and Brandon would likely continue to label me as selfish. I didn't care anymore. I had done everything I could for them, and now it was time to live the life I deserved. I knew my decision to move out would anger my parents and Brandon, but it didn't matter anymore. Years of living under the weight of favoritism and expectations had taught me that if I didn't stand up for myself, I would forever be a tool for their convenience. After that final conversation with my mom, I didn't return to the apartment right away. Instead, I spent the evening walking aimlessly, feeling a mix of relief and heaviness in my heart. Yet, the next morning, I woke up early and started packing. I didn't want anyone to know my plans until I was completely gone. I decided to leave behind the bigger items like the bed and furniture because they held too many unhappy memories. I only took my clothes, books, and the personal belongings that mattered most to me. As the room emptied out, I felt like I was shedding an old life, one I no longer wanted to be tied to. That afternoon, I signed the lease for my new apartment. It was a small, cozy place just 10 minutes from work. As I stepped into the empty room for the first time, I felt a sense of freedom I had never experienced before. No more Tommy's cries, no more endless arguments between Brandon and Grace, and no more guilt-tripping phone calls from my mom. This was my space, a place where I could finally start fresh. That evening, as I unpacked my belongings, my phone rang. It was my mom. I sighed, knowing the conversation wouldn't be pleasant. "Emily, what are you doing? Why did you move out without telling us? Don't you know Brandon and Grace need your help?" Her voice was a mixture of anger and disappointment. I stayed calm and replied, "Mom, I've done everything I can to help them. But this is my limit. I can't keep living like that." She wasn't willing to accept my answer. "You're being selfish, Emily. Family is about supporting each other. Brandon is struggling, and you're abandoning him as if you have no responsibility." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my frustration in check. "Mom, family doesn't mean forcing one person to carry the burden so everyone else can live comfortably. I've done my part. And now it's time for Brandon and Grace to take responsibility for themselves." Before she could say anything else, I added, "I've contributed enough, the rest is up to them." As I hung up, I felt both relieved and sad. Even though I knew I had made the right decision, the familiar feeling of being abandoned still lingered. But this time, I reminded myself that I wasn't the one being abandoned. I was the one choosing to walk away to protect myself. The first days in my new apartment were peaceful. Without the pressure to please anyone, I could focus entirely on my work and studies. I spent time decorating the apartment the way I liked, turning it into a small but warm and inviting space. I bought a new couch. Not to sleep on, but to relax on during quiet evenings spent reading after work. I even treated myself to a new set of bedding, something I had never considered before. A month after I moved out, I heard from my grandparents that Brandon and Grace still weren't paying rent, and my parents were covering all the costs. Hearing this, I could only smile sadly. I had expected this outcome, but it was no longer my problem. I was free from the responsibilities my family had unfairly placed on me. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was truly living, not for anyone else's expectations, but for myself. I began setting new goals, pursuing an MBA, advancing in my career, and building a life I could be proud of. Looking back on my journey, I realized that every hardship had its purpose. The unfairness and pain I endured had made me stronger, taught me to value myself, and given me the courage to walk my own path. And I knew that from this point forward, my life could only get better. After I left the apartment, my life gradually turned to a new chapter. Without Tommy's cries, Brandon and Grace's endless arguments, or the unreasonable pressures from my parents, I felt as though I had been set free. My small apartment became a sanctuary. A place where I found true peace and freedom. I spent time curating my living space, from picking out simple furniture, to decorating every corner with vintage items I adored. I was picturing that sunshine in the year. This is what my life would have been. For the first time in years, I felt the joy of living in an environment free of judgment or expectations. Meanwhile, according to my grandparents, my parents continued to shoulder all the financial burdens for Brandon and his family. The apartment I once rented had now become their free housing, which left my parents struggling to make ends meet. Brandon still hadn't found a job, and Grace, despite being a mother, constantly complained about everything. Tommy was growing up, but laughter in their household seemed to fade with time. Hearing all this, I didn't feel vindicated or satisfied. Only pity for my parents, who had chosen to put all their hopes and resources into someone who didn't appreciate it. As for me, my career continued to flourish. After a year of hard work, I was promoted to project manager at my company, earning enough to start saving for my future. I also decided to enroll in an evening MBA program, a decision that filled me with excitement as I invested in myself in ways I never thought possible. These efforts not only advanced my career, but also gave me a profound sense of pride, something I had never experienced while living with my family. One day, I ran into my mom at the grocery store. She seemed slightly surprised by my radiant and confident appearance. We exchanged a few polite words and I noticed she was still financially supporting Brandon. "Brandon and Grace are having another baby," she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. I smiled faintly but refrained from offering advice or opinions. I understood that this was the path she had chosen, and I no longer felt anger or heartbreak. I simply knew it was no longer my concern. Now, I live the life I once dreamed of, a peaceful life free from the weight of others' expectations. I make my own decisions about my career, education, and relationships. I've realized that to achieve true happiness, you sometimes have to let go of what isn't worth holding on to and focus on yourself. My journey hasn't been easy, but I'm proud to have found the strength to overcome and carve out my own path. Whether or not my parents ever change, my life is now mine alone, and no one can take that away from me. This story underscores the importance of setting personal boundaries, practicing self-love, and respecting yourself, even when it means distancing yourself from toxic family relationships. We shouldn't let favoritism or external pressures define our worth. Independence, determination, and the courage to say no when being taken advantage of are key to achieving happiness and success. Ultimately, true happiness comes from taking control of your life and valuing yourself. What are your thoughts on this story? How do you feel about Emily's decisions? Don't forget to follow this channel to discover more heartfelt stories and valuable life lessons. Join us in spreading these meaningful perspectives.